Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special early holiday edition of the Rumcast. Yeah, ho ho ho! A little pre-Christmas surprise. We wanted to get an extra episode out to you early, right before it should be the 23rd right now. So maybe you're traveling to spend time with loved ones. Maybe you just have a little time off for the holidays. Either way, we were able to do a really fun episode with Richard Seale from Foursquare. Yes. We're going to be talking all about the new Hiastra Rum from Foursquare. That's right, Hiastra Rum from Foursquare, something I think a lot of people didn't expect to see. We'll get into that in a minute, but in the spirit of the holiday season, John and I, my co-host John Gulla, I'm Will Hookinga, by the way. I don't usually do the intros. John usually does, so I'm a little off my game. You're supposed to say
this is the Rumcast, the podcast that, wait, now I forgot it.
Yeah, what do we do? I think it's the podcast where we talk to the people who love and shape it.
Yeah.
So that
all
is
things rum related.
All things rum related with the people who love and shape it. There we go. Yes. We've got our own podcast.
We got it together. Phew.
Anyway, we're very professional around here. But what we wanted to do before we get to the interview with Richard was just each extend a Christmas wish for the rum world in the spirit of the holiday season. So, John, hit me with, what is your wish? If you could have one wish for the rum category, the rum family, the rum universe, what would it be?
So this is, I put a lot of thought into this, Will, so I think this was a good one.
I'm guessing that
us.
You did because I texted you about this idea like 6 hours ago, so I just assumed you had been doing nothing else but pondering.
But that since yeah, you should see my whiteboard, like with all the writing and like crazy writing and symbols on it. No,
it's like it's like the chalkboard in the Good Will Hunting.
Yes, or A Beautiful Mind. Exactly. That's exactly right. I've got all this type of calculus on there. So I thought about this in different ways, and I thought about what was something that I really thought was impactful or could be impactful to the rum world. And so if you'll recall, Will, December 28th, almost exactly a year ago, December 28th, 2020, Matt Pretrick wrote an article about something, which was that the TTB said that now in the U.S. we can have 700 ml bottles.
Okay, I like where you're going with this. This actually something related to this crossed my mind, but I didn't pick it. So please continue.
Yeah, so that came out, and I remember rejoicing that day last Christmas, thinking, yes, this is finally the dawn of a new era. Waiting for. Yes, and yet this entire year, Will,
crickets.
I have seen nothing and no change and no 700 ml bottles in the U.S. And really, we even talked to a couple of people this year through some of our episodes about it, and then offhand and heard, just basically that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze just yet for various reasons.
I like that. I haven't heard that saying before.
Really?
Is that like a Florida orange juice kind of thing?
I don't know. I think I got it from some movie or something, but... Yeah, so it just struck me as like, if I really had a Christmas wish, it would be this year that we now have producers start to release all these amazing releases we see in Europe all the time here in the U.S., and then maybe also get some U.S. releases over to Europe. I want peace and joy and love and harmony amongst our rum communities and the ability to share in these special releases all across the world.
We have like the World Health Organization. We need the WRO, the World Rum. Or I guess it's organization.
World Rum Organization. I like it. The WRO
World Rum Organization.
We are starting it right now. Will, you and I are the first two members, and everybody else who's listening, you want to join the WRO? Let's do it.
Come join our coalition.
Yes.
I think the logic with that, kind of like you were saying, was part of the reason that, and this isn't the only reason, but part of the reason why we don't see some of these wonderful independent bottlings from Europe in the US is because like they'd have to do a whole separate bottling in the 750 ml size in order to get it over here. But I mean, like that's one obstacle, but it's still really difficult.
Sure.
I mean, like the fact that you have to get a different distributor for every state, and every state is different. So every state, I've been told, is kind of like entering a new country, basically. So
I know.
There's
they don't
other
make
obstacles.
It easy here.
Yeah. But hopefully, maybe we will see some momentum on that, because I would gladly also like pay a little less to get a little less with bottles.
I would too. Or, honestly, I'm okay with paying almost the same for a 700 and a 750. I may be in the minority. Some people might be out there shouting, shaking their fist at me right now, John.
Well, if it means more selection, I would pay the same amount.
Exactly. You're getting more interesting selections in your local area or in your region. I'm okay with that.
Okay.
And I'm okay with missing the extra 50 mLs to get that opportunity. So, hopefully that was the first step. There's many others, but my Christmas wish is going to magically remove all those impediments this year.
Love it.
And we're going to have more. So we'll follow that one up. What's your Christmas wish?
So the funny thing was, there's kind of two directions you can go in with this Christmas wish exercise. One is to do something very, spirit of the season, like talk about less arguing, more people like coming together, agree, like everyone agreeing that like transparency is the way, do a kind of, that kind of thing, like peace and love kind of vibes. I was afraid you would go that direction and then it would make me look small-minded, but we both went the small-minded, selfish direction. So I don't feel bad now. So my thing is also bottle related, but I mean, really it's at the end of the day, it's about what's inside the bottle. A frequent talking point or something we like to note every now and then. I've noticed anytime we talk about a rum that is 43% ABV, we're like, hey, thanks for that extra 3%. It makes a big difference up from the standard kind of bottom of the barrel 40% ABV. John, I want to take things a step further because if we're going to 43, why not go to 46?
46?
What if, you know how a lot of times you hear expressions like 30 is the new 40, that kind of thing. Or, wait, no, 40 is the new 30.
Right.
I want to mirror that spirit. Why not 46 be the new 43? I walk around the bourbon section every now and then when I'm trying to get to the rum section.
Right.
And I see a lot more standard releases that are above 40. You see a lot of 100 proof stuff like that. And I'm not saying rum has to be exactly like bourbon because I don't want rum to be like bourbon.
No.
I'm not saying you have to go all the way to 100 proof, even though...
But there are good things about bourbon,
I
right?
like that, sure.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, let's take this up a notch, Let's see some more kind of flagship releases that are just by standard up to 46 or even 48. That would be really nice to me. That extra 3% can go a long way. We even saw that with the rum that we helped release with Holmes Key. We went with 46% on that Fiji rum, and that little extra bump up in proof made a big difference, and I think it's a really nice little spot. So that is my Christmas wish for rum this year, is that we would see a mass movement upwards just a little bit. I'm not saying everything has to creep up to that proof. Just give us a few options that go up just a little bit. I think our listeners would really like that. And I'm definitely, I have them in my heart with this wish, not me.
I was thinking the same thing. It's all about everybody out there in the community. Yes, we're totally altruistic here. But I agree with you. And I think I've mentioned before on the podcast that 46, 48 kind of feels like a nice sweet spot for me as a connoisseur, if you'll allow me that term, for just...
Well, I wouldn't have allowed it, but this is your podcast too, so I can't stop you.
Well, that's right. I said it now. It is what it is. Sorry, not taking it back. So I do think that for us who are heavy into rum and into spirits in general, probably, the 40 is a bit low. And although I do enjoy some rums at 40%, there are still some out there that I don't mind it, but I could, to your point, see it being much better at a 43 or then 46%. So raising that floor a little bit, I can see where you're coming from with other spirit categories doing similar things and enjoying that. And I think we are going to see that. And I do think we're seeing some movement with it. There's at least 2 rums, and I'm not going to say any more than that now, but for our upcoming episode where we talk about our rums of the year categories, there's at least 2 rums there that I noticed that part of the reason I think that I picked them is because they sit higher than 45%.
Well, and another rum that is, at this point, it's not just a special release, it's kind of a standard thing, is Probitas, which is bottled at 47% ABV, I believe. And bringing it full circle, comes from Foursquare, but has
Bam.
some, kind of higher ester rum from Hampton blended in with it. But now, as we're about to find out from Richard Seale in this interview, Foursquare has made its own take on high ester rum.
Right.
And I think...
And why that term is problematic.
Exactly, yeah. I love hearing Richard's take on kind of choosing the lesser of three evils when describing the rum as high ester. So, but
I wish you all could see the pain on his face when he had to do it as well.
Yes, it was great.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people out there have probably at this point kind of seen rumblings of this. Maybe they've seen the label shot from the upcoming Vellier release, Habitation Vellier release of this rum, which is the sample that you and I were both sent from a friend of the podcast who attended the Barbados Rum Experience and got to try this rum right there at Foursquare. She brought back some of the rum and sent us some samples, so we were able to try it. And as soon as we kind of heard about this concept of a high ester rum coming from Foursquare and getting to try it, we reached out to Richard because we wanted the full story. And what I was really excited to learn going into the interview is doing this style of rum indicative of a sort of new direction that Foursquare is going in. And I don't mean leaving behind what they're great at already. But kind of adding something to their arsenal. Or is this kind of like a one-off, hey, here's this cool thing that we can do. And the person who shared the sample with us did, kind of frame it as being sort of showing some of the possibilities there still are within the framework of the proposed GI. That you can come up with something that you probably haven't tasted anything like it from Barbados before. And I think that's part of it. But, in talking to Richard, that side of it actually didn't really come up. It's really more about a process at Foursquare that started several years back. And I honestly think that maybe 10 years from now, the rums that we're seeing coming out of Foursquare, I think I think they're going to stay true to what we think of when we think of Foursquare, but I think there's going to be a breadth in the amount of variance, sort of new angles and things like that using fresh cane juice in some of their rums that they're making there. Like, I really think we might view what's happening right now as kind of like not a turning point, but like there was kind of Foursquare before this and Foursquare after this.
An inflection point, maybe?
Yeah, an inflection point. Or kind of like a new era in, how we think about the rum that comes from there. So, yeah. Did you have any particular takeaways or anything from the interview?
Well, anytime you get a chance to talk to Richard Seale, it's going to be an enlightening experience, and that's pretty much exactly what it is. And almost all of our questions are centered on the idea of talking about that high ester production. But there's some other things in there that are always fun to hear from Richard, and always enjoy speaking to him. And he's obviously left an indelible mark, you might say, on the rum industry at this point.
Working in the newest ECS release in there,
shaking up the shibboleth. You might say, or I don't know. I don't have anything else for right now, but yeah, it's always enlightening.
Yeah. And if you're wondering right now, like, what is a high ester rum? Like, why is this, a big deal or interesting that Foursquare is doing this? We get into all that with Richard. We kind of talk about, I think what comes to mind for most people when they hear high ester are Jamaican rums. Although there are high ester rums made outside of Jamaica, but we get into all that and like, what he considers to be a high ester rum and that sort of thing, and why they're doing it at Foursquare and what it's going to look like going forward. So all that and more coming up in the interview.
Okay, so we are here with Richard Seale from Foursquare Rum in Barbados, and longtime listeners, you may be having some deja vu right now, but it is exactly the second time that we've now had Richard Seale on the podcast. And Richard, it's been nearly 2 full years since we last spoke, if you can believe it, just prior to COVID. I think most rum geeks like us who listen to this podcast will be at least somewhat well acquainted with what Foursquare has been up to since then, but wanted to ask from your perspective, what's been going on with you and at Foursquare since early on in 2020?
Yes, we've been busy with quite a few things, which timing did come together. A lot of the reasons why they came together is because sort of COVID delayed a few things. And then once things started to get more relaxed, then they sort of came together. So if you look at the pot still project, I dare not tell you when I ordered that.
So this is the new pot still that you brought in, right?
Yeah, exactly. So then that shipped last year. It's taken all of this year to do the commissioning, because all the bits and actually the main the control system, which is always by necessity the last piece, because you finalize everything that you're going to control. So, but yeah, that would obviously be the highlight, which is still to pull off. We're commissioning it this week. So yeah.
Does that mean like using it for the first time?
Well, we've run as far as we've run hot water through it. So we've distilled water in it.
So rum will be a little more interesting than water.
Yeah. So the first step of the commissioning was to set up and check all the instruments. And because we have quite a bit of sophistication on this one, that was quite a challenge. And everything is a little more difficult because of growth things. This pot still is unusual. It has 3 pumps, and pot stills don't have pumps. Pot stills just run on the vapor pressure. But having 3 pumps is fine. It goes 3 pumps through 3 variable speed inverters, and they get very complicated to set up. And then it's got a level indicator, but it's not your average level indicator. It's electronic. It can tell you the level of the liquid, the level of the foam. It can tell you the rate in which they're changing. So one of the things about the 2 pot stills at Foursquare, it's a very good example of how you take a very, very old principle that the double retort has been in place for over 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, batch distillation has been from 1600s. But here you take the double retort, and you're not doing anything really different than the distiller of early 1800s. But what you have is the tools of control and measuring. Well, you have the tools and control and measuring. I couldn't have dreamed of 5 years ago, far less the guy in the 1800s. So it's a good illustration of that.
Is that because has technology changed that much in the 5 years, or is it just you couldn't have imagined having something this sophisticated?
I mean, a lot of automation and things like that. Batch distillation has not always had a lot of automation, because when you think of automation, the things that lend themselves best to automation are steady state things. So, I mean, the most obvious layman example I can give you is an aircraft flying level. Well, I mean, that's just
cruise control.
Yeah, exactly. That's why we had autopilot systems for a long time, and now more and more sophisticated. But because there's nothing a computer system likes better than to keep everything in a steady state. And so continuous distillation has always lent itself well to automation. Batch distillation, because it does not have a steady state condition, has always been, much more of a manual, and always having a manual level of input. So, the automation there again is more about, as I say, feeding information and precise measurements, precise control. But there's not going to be a computer system where you just switch it on and it says, "Okay, batch distill me some rum." Whereas,
like a K-cup coffee machine or something.
Yeah, whereas the column stiller, once you get the column still up around, I mean, the column still is literally very analogous to fermenting in the sense that you start it all up, and then you sort of leave the systems to control, and you just keep your eye on everything. Batch still is not like that. It's still much more of a manual intermediate process. But as I say, the batch stills still give you, our 2 batch stills give you a good illustration of how you can take this fundamentally the same process and add these little tools, these little things. So, like, for example, the other thing that's very clever on youth still is the heating system. So again, in the early 1800s, it would have been fire driven.
Right.
Now I have a twin heating system, steam coil and steam jacket, steam bain marie. All the chefs listening will know what I mean by a bain-marie.
Right. I know that from my baking show watching experience.
Exactly. So, and the very, very earliest stills, actually, sort of the original ceramic stills of an alchemist, or for an apothecary making, would have had bain-maries. But, when stills got larger and for spirit making, they went with, fire driven. But now, so we have this twin system. So it's very, very, very clever, because it really, that was for, a very controlled and very even heating and very low difference in temperature of steam versus temperature of the liquid. So it's good also for energy savings, but it's really taking that control of how you deliver the necessary energy into your molasses wine to get it to distill and do it in the most controlled manner that you can possibly do it.
When you bring in a new still like that, I imagine some of the impetus for that is to expand capacity. But is there a period of time where you kind of approach it from, okay, we have this new still, this new variable, we have to figure out, the best way to use this to make our rum, to be able to get as close as we can to how we make rum in the other stills? Or do you see it more as, how can this add something a little different to what we do? How do you approach that?
It's very much so. Adding, in the 25 years, it's things have changed. Not in terms of what we make, but in terms of what the opportunities are. I mean, okay, the changes in what we make too, obviously, which we're going to just fast explain.
Right, yeah. We'll get there eventually.
But it's all driven by the opportunities, and that's the real change. So what I mean is, if I go back, when I discuss the Foursquare vintages, one of the motivations I explained the vintages is, as opposed to a permanent skew, your vintages can sort of, reflect the desire at the time. And so sometimes when people go back in the case Foursquare 1998, or they look at Foursquare 1998, and I had the chance to take some the other day, I was actually pleasantly surprised at how good it went.
Were you a little afraid of what you might find?
Yeah, I was like, because as I explaining, back then, that was 100% column still rum. Because back then, that was very trendy. People wanted lighter rums. People wanted sweet rums. They wanted, and so the kind of thing that we were competing with at that time was like sweetened rums. So released Foursquare 1998 in 2008. 40% column still. This represented the uber geeks at this time. Other than the really uber, because there always were a few drinking the Caranese.
Right.
But, a rum enthusiast at the time might have been drinking some of these other, beginning with a Z.
Yeah.
I mean, I literally had one serious rum enthusiast, come and visit me and tell me, that Foursquare 1998 is his favorite rum of all time. And, but his other favorite rum was, and he named that rum beginning with. So again, it's not that we weren't doing pot still rum at the time. And the blends, the Pearl Seale 10-year-old at that time, I didn't pot still, but it was like, okay, we're going to do this Foursquare 1998 instead of really show off this sweet column rum style. And now what's happened is, let's say the opportunities have changed. So because the opportunities have changed and people now want the heavier style rums, and there's a market. I mean, there was always a market, but it's now bigger. There's more who appreciate the style of rum. So something that used to happen in the past more often will come back, which is selling 100% pot still rum. I mean, that used to happen in Barbados. I think Abbey was the last to do it. And I think they stopped there in, I think, the 60s or 70s, but it was, it was not uncommon for Barbadians to drink. And if you go back, and I've done this, I've tasted some with, from Steve Rim's collection. You go back and you taste a Barbados rum for the 1970s. It's very light, because this was the fashion style. This is what wanted. If you put too much pot still rum in your rum in the 1970s, people would reject it. They're drinking, 1970s is the dark ages of all spirit. It's Scotch whiskey and bourbon, and it's a tribal era. Because everyone's just drinking rum and coke or whatever. It's just a terrible, terrible era. So yeah, I mean, you move with the time. So when we put in, come back to your original question. So when we put in the pot still, it's not a reflecting so much an overall increase in capacity because, of course, we still only ferment what we ferment.
Sure.
But it reflects the fact that there is more demand for the style of rums that is going to come out of Boston.
Well, it'll be cool to see you guys getting that up and running down there for sure. To move a little bit into the Hiastra, we'll get there in a second. But I was going back and I was listening to when we had you on the show last time, because that was the first time I remember. It was near the end of the interview, and it was the first time I heard you talk about making cane juice rum at Foursquare, which I know the Hiastra isn't all cane juice, but we'll get to that in a second. But I remember, I think you said at the time you were sourcing cane from a farmer in St. George who was still hand cutting, and then you were taking you were milling it at the distillery, and then you were also getting some juice directly from St. Nicholas Abbey.
That's correct. I did not get any from Nicholas in 20 or 21, but in the past we did.
Okay.
I mean, which is a reflection of success on Nicholas's part, because they basically have enough demand
to use.
Yeah. So originally I was taking from them because they couldn't distill all, but now they have enough demand between the cane they used to make the rum and the cane they make to make syrup, and they sell syrup.
Mm-hmm.
I joke sort of with Larry, but it's wonderful how I helped him get started with a little rum, and he helped me get started.
Right.
It sort of come full circle.
Mm-hmm.
So you said at the time that was like your fifth crop of cane, I think, back in 2020.
So I started in 2016 and 2017, it was only Nicholas. And then 2018, we started grinding. So 18 and 19, we were grinding both Ashbury's cane and Nicholas's cane.
Okay.
And in 2020, we have been only grinding Ashbury's cane. And what's been happening is we've been taking more and more from Ashbury Plantation. In fact, we take, I think, more or less all in cane now. So they're very happy. What they do in the beginning of the crop, they sort of assess the cane. The not so good cane, they say, all right, let's send that to the sugar factory.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
So literally, Michael, the owner, he literally calls you and says, right, I'll be ready for you at whatever date, because I'm going to send the first couple of weeks of crop. I'm going to cut this not so great stuff and send to the factory, and then I'll get that out of the way, and then I'll start the cutting for you.
Kind of the good stuff for rum. So have you been making cane juice rum for several years now then?
Yes, but of course it was small. I mean, the first 2 years was, every year we've done more. So the first 2 years were relatively small. Then we pretty well jumped it up quite a bit in 18 and 19, but then 20 and 21 even bigger still.
And so were you, barreling some of that and setting it aside, or,
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So do you see that as being maybe a blending component or something? Like, do you have...
Yeah, we will see the 2016 stuff. I haven't peeked at it recently. I used to peep at it quite a bit in the beginning, but now it's time to leave it alone and let it be. But, that basically turned 5 years.
Wow.
It will keep going. We'll think about what we'll do with it when it gets to about 10 years old or so.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right. We'll check. I'll set a calendar reminder to check back in about four more years or so.
Part 3.
Yeah. When you first started working with juice, did you just kind of like, because I imagine doing it, I know it's different from working with molasses. Did you just kind of dive right in? Did you call colleagues who work with it regularly? Like, what did that process look like?
Oh yeah, let me take a step back and why juice, and this is and it really explains also why Hiastra. We didn't sit there one day and say, okay, we're going to make Hiastra Rum. And in fact, I want to mention how much I hate the name Hiastra, but lesser of about 3 evil choices.
We'll come back to that because I want to know.
Exactly. We'll come back to that. I almost cringe every time I say it. Anyway, the whole Hiastra, the whole cane juice, the whole flows from a much bigger concept. Today we have this, and I think we maybe talked about this in the last one, but today we have this construct where we think rum is either from molasses or rum from juice, right? Because there's this big division. And sort of even worse of this division, we think, oh, the rum from juice must be superior to the rum from molasses. And I mean, and there are people out there who simply go, oh, I only drink rum, rum or coal or whatever. I don't touch this. And there's nothing wrong with my friends in agriculture. There's nothing wrong with them preferring their rum, absolutely. But it's quite new, this division. It really started with the concept of centralization, and the French actually were the first with this. And so what I mean is it really starts with rum not being made on a sugar estate. So historically, rum is made on a sugar estate.
Right.
There's no division between molasses and juice. Both are in the formulation. Mm-hmm. And it varies from estate to estate. It varies from island to island. But what happens it starts in Martinique, centralization, where we create a central sugar factory. And what happens now, the sugar estate doesn't crush its own cane anymore. It sends to the central sugar factory. So, of course, if you don't crush your cane anymore, you can't make rum anymore.
Right.
But with centralization, sugar factory becomes the birth of the industrial distillery. This is the distillery that is independent of any sugar estate. This is the distillery that's in a city. Mm-hmm. And this distillery can exist because of two things. It can exist because of the column still, so it can scale up and distill on great scale. And it can now buy in on a great scale lots of molasses because there's a thing called a central sugar factory.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And we have the analog in Scotland. Green whiskey is whiskey industrial. Okay? So rum industrial is actually born first before rum agricole. And rum industrial is not called rum industrial because it's molasses. It's not this, again, there's not this, there's not this division, oh, if you make it from juice, it's agricole. No, there's a lot more things in there that is juice. Or, in other words, there's a nonsensical statement to sort of say, Hamden is making rum industrial. I mean, this is the most asinine statement you could come up with because, that's a sugar estate. Right. There's not an industrial factory.
Right.
So this is what happens. So we've got these two absurdities, which is that rum industrial is because of the raw material. No, rum industrial is because it's a big factory in the city. And this is famously in Saint-Pierre in Martinique. And Martinique then started to make huge amounts of rum in the 19th century. Of course, it was also assisted by things like the Oxford and all the rest of it. But this is the birth of a very different concept. A distillery in the city buys in its molasses. Mm-hmm. What happened when we did Foursquare is we kind of had this sort of anomaly because we went back and resurrected a whole sugar estate, but did this odd thing of buying in molasses. So Foursquare gets its molasses either imported or from the local sugar factory. Well, when Foursquare was first distilling, there were still 3 sugar factories left in Barbados. And so we would get the molasses in, but it wasn't grinded at Foursquare. The motivation to doing this is to re-blur that line, not have this notion that this, or the even more ridiculous notion that that the English style rums are from molasses and the French style rums are from sugar cages. Again, this is nonsense because when you look at the French, French agricole is from juice, but French rum industrial is from molasses. So again, and then all of the historic sugar estates, whether Hamden, Bonfon, and the hundreds that we've lost, they will use both juice and molasses. Hamden to this day still uses juice and molasses.
Right.
Yeah. So this notion that the English style of rum is from molasses, it's a nonsense. So this is a larger motivation is to bring Foursquare back to its roots and say it is all making rum from cane. Obviously, we had to start with Ashbury because Foursquare, for all the listeners, Foursquare is surrounded by sugar cane.
Right.
But Foursquare, there are 2 entities which were split years ago. So Foursquare historically was a sugar plantation, but the sugar works of Foursquare was split into a separate company. And Foursquare plantation continued. And Foursquare plantation still continues to this day. It surrounds what was Foursquare's factory, which is what we purchased. So they were split. So we're still surrounded to this day by Foursquare plantation. Why don't we buy the cane from Dennis? Because they machine cut. They're quite a large sugar estate and quite sophisticated. And we need the hand cut. So we go to an estate in St. George, which the lie of the land just does not suit machine cut. So they still hand cut.
What does that change for you? Like, why do you prefer hand cut?
Because what happens is with the machine cut, it takes the cane and it cuts it into pieces. So the stalk of cane will be about 8 pieces, and every end that you create is an end for bacteria to get in and for gumming and lots of problems. So when you make the juice from this machine cut, you could potentially have more problems than a hand cut with the 2 ends. And the other thing with the machine cut is they don't care about all of the, what we call the cane trash, or the leaves. So, when you see a cane load head into the factory, you can hardly recognize that there's cane in there. It's so full of every bit of junk. Whereas what we feed into the mill is a clean stalk of cane.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, when it's hand cut, they don't always do the best job of cleaning it, but then we clean it. So when you're making sugar, none of that matters. You just process it in, and all of that stuff is going to get filtered out. It's not going to bother your sugar at all, but it's going to bother my rum fermentation. So that's the broad motivation. So then how do we end up with Hiastra rums? Well, again, what we decided to do with juice is we decided, which was again an opportunity, which was to do naturally fermented rums. And naturally fermented rums would always tend to have a higher acidity and would always therefore have a higher ester. The big difference, there's a couple of few differences, but one of the difference when we sort of post, and we post a silly number of high ester, the difference of the Jamaicans is the Jamaicans have it down to they have it down to a fine art. They have it down to a recipe. It's like they want to make LROK next week, they can set things in the process to. Now, I should clarify that, because one of the things which people don't appreciate is, no, they can't actually just plant in one day. Everything goes very slowly. So they can okay, we're making high ester, we'll switch to low ester in a couple of weeks. Everything moves really slowly. But they certainly do have it down its process. With some of the high ester rums we were doing, it's been more of an opportunistic situation where cane coming at the end of your crop, it's quite rich in bacteria and it's quite rich, so the juice is very acidic. And so it's more of an opportunistic thing rather than a routine situation. So it's like, don't come to me in January and say, make me the same rum. I don't have to do it.
So all that bacteria and acid is essentially more conducive to the long fermentations and ester development and things like that.
So what happens, yes. So one of the things that, again, today, because of the recipes and the formulation, people forget that, especially like Jamaica, we're making high ester rums long before anybody called them high ester rums.
Right.
As far as they're concerned, they were making rum.
Right.
And eventually they got, those classifications, but anything now on the 300 it was, common clean, and then they had the plumbers and wooden birds. Eventually they were what they call the continental high ester rums. And they were called continental high ester rums because they were strictly for Europe. Europe was known as the continent. So that's why you have the name continental in the names. They weren't sold in Jamaica.
The flavored rums for Germany and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And they were used for dilution. And even to this day, notwithstanding the interest, someone like Hamden, they would sell those continental high ester rums, would sell more in non-rum than rum.
Like perfume and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, if you ask Ian A. Shear, how do you split your sales of these continental high esters? So my point is that, no one sat down to make a high ester rum per se. And I didn't sit down to make a high ester rum. I sat down to make, naturally fermented cane juice rums, some of which will put with high esters.
Got it.
So that's, the question is what you call it.
Yeah, I want to hear this. So what's the problem with the high ester? What irks you about that?
Well, it's the same thing. Okay, so I make rums from cane, and the first thing people ask, well, you make an agricole? No, I am not. And and the thing is, it's not that I wouldn't want to make agricole. It's quite the opposite. It's because I certainly I respect my agricole friends. I don't want them to think that I'm trying to mimic them. So no, because there's far more into agricole than just
using cane juice. Yeah.
And once upon a time, and we're a little bit our own selves to blame for this, because once upon a time we would use use those words interchangeably because, every single cane juice rum was agricole. Now you have all these people doing different cane juice. So now we have to make this distinction. But we almost set ourselves up for that mistake. So that's the thing. And then the same problem then comes, if I say I'm making a Hiastra Rum, you're making the
Jamaican rum?
Yeah. I'm making the Jamaica rum.
Yeah.
So kind of the old-fashioned name might have been, when I say old-fashioned, the kind of distinction of the last several years might have been to say, okay, I'm making a heavy rum because, it was my name is rum, and then when column stills and added yeast, and then created this notion of a light rum. So then, we tended to refer to things like pot still rum as heavy rums, or like heavy Carney, Carney.
Right, yeah, that was coming to mind for me. Yeah.
One of the things that people don't realize is that when Carney was in operation, the vast majority of what they made was light rum. So Carney had a multi-column still which banged out the light rum, and then they had this separate single column still which banged out the heavy rum. Of course, all of the light rum disappeared. When the place was closed, all that stock was gone. It's this heavy rum stock that is used. Well, it was always historically used so sparingly. So in a sense, the correct terminology would be to say to you, "I'm making a heavy rum." But today we associate heavy rum with these Carnies and stuff. And of course, taste-wise, it's nowhere
completely different.
Like
yeah.
Saying Ester was kind of the lesser of the three bad choices.
Heavy ester doesn't work, right?
Yeah, but it is not a Jamaican style rum. Obviously, there is overlap because if you look at some Jamaican rums that are naturally fermented, but not all Jamaican rums are naturally fermented. Right. You go to, and taste some Jamaican, from, Appleton or whatever, and they're unmistakably Jamaican. But they have used added yeast.
I think that's one of the cool things to me, learning more about rum, though, is you realize from a production standpoint, there can be all these different paths that different distilleries in the same country might take, and yet they still arrive at a profile or a signature, a style that is like you said, like Appleton, you have it. There's characteristics about it that are unmistakably Jamaican.
I readily say that the Barbados, what we call the Barbados rum style, largely developed around the turn of the 20th century because of the influence of column still, centralization, and more or less all of the changes through rum. We love to have this romantic interest of creativity, but really, rum for most of its years and is a commodity. And most of the changes in rum are driven by economics.
Survival.
Exactly. So, rum agricole is born out of survival. It's born out of the shock to the system of centralization. And how do we survive? The arrival of the column still, is about efficiency. How do we, everything, added yeast, everything. So it's the social and economic factors that have driven the changes. It's not someone sitting down one day and thinking, I think I'll try and make rum this way. As much as we like to romanticize that, the Creole column, in agricole is there because, your juice, you want to distill your juice pretty quickly. It's not, so you need something that's more efficient than in terms of speed than the pot still, but you also want something to give you the quality in it. In other words, the coffee still would not have suited them. Mm-hmm. And the Creole column still is like that perfect tool for them, giving them what they need. And so it's, as they say, it's all of these things are largely driven, the history, which for me is much more interesting. I mean, it's vastly more interesting to understand the social and the economic dynamics that drive these changes.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, they're like the external things.
Yeah, than just, someone decided, hey, I'm going to try a different barrel or some other trait.
So you have this idea. You're saying, I'm going to make this, for lack of a better term, Hiastra Rum. And
natural fermentation.
Yes.
That's the emphasis, right?
So in other words, what happened is, here I got this different raw material, and what can I do with this raw material that's not, molasses is not so suited for?
Right.
And that's natural fermentation. And it's not that molasses is impossible to do natural fermentation, but one of the things that when molasses leaves the factory, it's kind of in a sort of almost sterile state, and it becomes much more difficult to carry out natural fermentation.
Right. Did the rest of the process kind of spring out of your head like the goddess Athena all at once, or did you have to figure out and say, okay, how are we going to do this?
So one of the stories I say about it, quite amusingly true, is I've been doing molasses fermentation with yeast for, 25 years. And so I kind of had this idea that I knew a bit about fermentation, and, I was a bit of an expert. And then when I started doing natural fermentation, I realized I knew fuck all.
Happens to me every day.
Fuck all about yeast. And and so it really, it's a total, as I say, it really sort of sends you back to the drawing board.
Mm-hmm.
What is it about it that makes it so different?
Well, the yeast are different every crop. They're different in the month. The cane can be different, so the different acidity levels, and the yeast can behave differently. And then that's where we can talk about the Saccharomyces and S. Pombe, because they behave differently. And you need S. Pombe, and when you don't have it or enough of it, it's a problem. So in other words, so sometimes I like to say, I like to look at it from a different perspective. And imagine that I'm a distiller of natural fermentations, and along comes a salesman and says, I've got this magic stuff. And you just add it in, and you're going to get a consistent result. You're going to get a consistent yield.
Right.
Everything's going to be really predictable now. Consistent flavor. Well, obviously, you're going to just go bananas.
Life
with
is
joy.
easy.
Yeah. So you realize why the directions that, spirit making went in. Or even think back to the brewers. Brewers, they couldn't select their yeast, and some yeast gave a cloudy beer, and some yeast gave a sour beer, and then yeast selection comes in. It's eureka. Yeah. So the funny thing about doing the natural fermentation is you then kind of realize, how wonderful it was when the guy turned up and said, I have this cultured yeast for you. Why don't you pitch this added yeast? The accountants will love you because suddenly now you can predict the yield. So that again, so it comes back again to opportunities, because one of the problems with doing what we're doing, so it's quite small scale, clean and cane, it's natural, it's very, very expensive. And so therefore you cannot even conceive of doing this unless you have the ability to, put a bottle of rum on the shelf for $100 or something like that. So, 10 years ago, you might have said to me, why don't we do some natural juice fermentation rums? And I would have thought, that's a fabulous idea, but it's financially impossible.
Mm-hmm.
As 10 or 15 years ago, I might have been struggling to sell a $25 bottle of rum, dear, not aged too long. Right. So it's, as you say, that's, yes, juice is different, but I do try to emphasize that it's not that rum is fundamentally changing. It's just we have the opportunity. So, we obviously always had cast strength rum. We just didn't sell it as cast strength. Obviously, we have pot still rum, but today we can use more of it. So, and obviously, we always had the ability in theory to age rum for 12 or 13 or 14 years.
Yeah.
But, back in the bad old 1970s, it was very hard to conceive. As they say, we went the reverse. I mean, we had really wonderful old rums in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s.
Right.
And by the 1970s, a lot of them had disappeared.
You're just trying to staying alive in the 1970s, so I had to do it. Sorry.
And now we're seeing the reverse. So, we were missing some of these really old rums in the 70s, 80s, to an extent in the 90s. And now, because people, rum's been doing really well in the last 10, 15 years. So people are now saying, okay, yeah, I can keep that. I can keep that 12-year-old stock a little longer. There's an opportunity now.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's great. And so doing the cane juice is about a situation of recognizing that the opportunities are there.
We should probably establish, by the way, what exactly is in this Hiastra rum, because it's not just juice, as I understand it. There's some
Correct.
molasses rum in here that goes through a different fermentation process. So can you kind of talk people through, what the makeup of the rum is?
It's a blend,
mm-hmm.
and it's all 100% pot still. It's all 100% Barbados cane.
Okay.
But there are some rums, so purely molasses. There are some cane juice rums. And then there are cane juice rums with very extreme high ester that were made at the end of crop, compartmentalized off, and used for blending. And so what we did is we made a small batch, because obviously we blend and barrel the stuff off, and we said, okay, just for fun, we're going to release 600 bottles of this blend. So it ends up with a Hiastra count, and again, I'm using sort of Jamaica scale. So basically, in Jamaica, anything over 300 is technically a Hiastra Rum, because under 300 is coming clean.
Mm-hmm.
And this, I haven't tested it, but I think it's about 600.
Okay, I was kind of thinking it was probably somewhere in that, I don't like 400 to 700 type range, because it's got that pungency to it,
mm-hmm.
and but you know, it's not the upper kind of.
No, I mean, so if you again using the Jamaicans as a reference, the kind of the highest naturally fermented rums they would do with those Plumbers and Weddenburns going up to that 600 or 700, and then the continentals, where they're the silly 1,000 plus. So I did not. It would have been extremely unlikely that I would release a blend sort of higher than those Plumbers and Weddenburns, because they're the highest that are still very drinkable. And this is an important point, which I think gets lost. Normally, dilution, of course, is your enemy, but when you get those very highest rums, their real power comes out with dilution. Why they're used in this way. So when I do a rum here about 600 or whatever, you can drink it straight. And you won't necessarily, I mean, you can dilute it, obviously, but it's not going to improve the dilution.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you start getting very high, the rums improve for the dilution, which is antithetical to everything we normally, I mean, not too much dilution, obviously. But that's what's so powerful about those continental Hiastra rums. They're magic in dilution. So yeah, so the idea really here is, I mean, 600 bottles, people are going to do, make a mix to drink, but it's fine. Drink it neat, it's fine. You can do whatever, however you wish to enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, John and I are both sitting here drinking it neat right now.
Straight. Yep.
I mean, really enjoy. Before you got on, I was talking to John. I was like, Is it crazy for me to say, because obviously this fact is somewhat implanted in my brain by knowing what this is and where it came from. But I was like, is it crazy to say that there's something here, even though this is completely different from anything I've ever had from Foursquare, there's something kind of Foursquare-ish about it.
Absolutely.
Like a little bit of a signature, kind of like the bottom end of it.
This is one of the things that's very important to us. And it really comes down to what your philosophy is and what your approach is, doing the style that you want to do, what you like. I've given this story a couple of times, and maybe I gave it last. I remember I had this conversation. I was approached by a very large spirit company, very successful, but tended to be lower end, high volume product. Mm-hmm. And so they were getting into to rum, and they were talking to the distilleries, and of course we weren't the right partner for them. But they said very proudly still, we do all our research, we do all our focus groups, we find exactly what the consumer want, and that's what we do. And so without missing a beat, I looked at them and said, I do the complete opposite. I say, I make what I like, and then see if I can find someone who has the same taste. So yeah, I mean, I would almost dare to say this is Hiastra Rum as you might expect Foursquare will do it. And Foursquare is going to do it differently to him or Long Pond or whoever.
For sure.
Because they're them and we are us, and we have a different, everyone has, I was having a conversation just yesterday with a very prominent member of our industry, and he wanted some advice on stills. And I was trying to basically say to him, it's not my, you need to kind of go, it's okay for you to go with your philosophies. Mm-hmm. In other words, it's not necessary for you to, I mean, I gave up some advice, but it's not a situation where, since I like XYZ, you should like XYZ. I mean, I'll give you an example. It's not the example, but because I don't want to give away too much on the conversation. But if you said to me, sort of worm tub or shell and tube heat exchanger, well, I'm going to say shell and tube heat exchanger. If you look at Foursquare rums, they're very elegant and soft, and you go to those skis that are still done in worm tubs, and they're meaty and sulfury and rough. But if that's what you like,
right,
then you should worm tub.
Yeah.
Don't ask me, because I like something different.
Yeah.
So you're going to get the Foursquare answer.
Right.
So, one of the things about the Hiastra rum is, of course, it's very soft and very drinkable. And again, because that's very much what we try to do.
It doesn't feel like 62% to me.
Exactly.
No.
And that's harder to do with a Hiastra rum than a regular rum because, of course, you have to have a lot of acidity. You have to distill it in such a way that you try not to get some of those semi-volatile acids to come over into your rum.
Is that where does the molasses component help with that as well?
Yes. In other words, doing a blend helps with that because obviously the Hiastra rums will definitely be a little sharper. So the beauty of doing the blend, yes, absolutely.
And just to clarify, to make sure I'm understanding, so this blend that we're drinking, this is the one that Velier is releasing. Is that correct? It's the same blend?
Yes. Let me see. Hang on a minute. Yes, because I took it from the tank that's to be bottled. We haven't bottled it yet.
Uh-huh.
I was just trying to think because initially, when I sent samples, I just made a quick lab sample of the blend. But this is the one I showed off at BRE, the Barbados Rum Experience.
Right.
And I took it from the actual tank, 90% certain. Yeah, so it should be exactly the same.
Okay. And is this one, you kind of mentioned, it sounded, I was interpreting it as you have several different types of cane juice rum you've made at varying ester levels. I may have misinterpreted, but is this blend just one of those cane juice rums, or is it multiple different levels?
This is a particular one selected at the end of season and distilled separately and put separately. And then that's used as a blending component. So that there's a specific rum in there that we only make a very small amount. And that is the, key element of this particular rum. Yes.
Gotcha.
Not to try to confuse you too much, but basically at the end of the crop, there's some opportunities presented, and we go about and make a slightly different. But really, the cane juice rums we classify as Hiastra because it's just their nature.
Okay. Got it.
It's very hard to make a naturally fermented rum full of bacteria and acidity, and then expect then you're not going to have a very high level of esters. It just runs the nature.
What are kind of the future plans for, again, for lack of a better term, high ester production at Foursquare going forward? Do you see this, or do you plan to make more? Are you aging any of it?
So basically, every year we are making cane juice, full body, heavy cane juice rums, let's use that term. But we're also making a small amount of these very high ester ones, which have then gone into different blends. Yeah, I mean, the majority, so not to confuse you too much. So you got your column still. Let's put that out of the way.
Okay, yeah.
And then you got your molasses pot still rums, your sort of regular fermentation.
Right.
So, they're not exactly low ester either. I mean, it's rum. I mean, rum immediately has a decent ester count compared to, things like Scotch whiskey or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got your sort of mainstream cane juice rums, but they're a step up because they're naturally fermented. And then there's this high ester rum in which we've made a couple of batches and used for blending.
Do you ever see releasing any of that on its own? I know people will be asking for it.
No, it's too high. Again, it comes back to the power of bringing out the best of it. So, the highest ester rum we made was, I think, 1900.
Oh, wow.
But the power of that rum comes out in the blend, not in that rum straight. You shoot yourself in the foot if you drink that straight. Or deal with that straight. The magic of that comes when you blend it. The magic and the power in that rum.
I want to go back to the yeast for a second. So I know in this one, in the bottle, it does say it was cultured and natural yeast that are used. And you mentioned Pombe already once. We recently had Steven Schellenberger from Boston Apothecary on the podcast. He spoke a lot about the high potential of the Pombe, or that fission yeast in rum production. I know I've seen some comments from you online that you kind of acknowledged it, that it plays some role, but also kind of had the idea of like, I think you were saying it's not really that remarkable. So I wanted to just get a little bit more from you about that.
So there are two myths that sort of come about with Pombe. And, just to maybe take a step back, what happened around the turn of the century, it was about 1903 or something. Jamaicans created this special fermentation laboratory, and they wanted to do all this work in it. Mm-hmm. And really kind of improve the rum making and efficiency. And the first man there was Charles Allen, and he did some fantastic work. And then he was followed by SF Ashby. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But before that, a lot of the guys that talk about the work of Percival Gregg, because Gregg went up to the laboratory up in Copenhagen, where one of the big errors in isolating and purifying yeast, and that Professor Hansen was there. So Gregg became very much influenced by this notion of what was happening in the breweries, that yeast should be selected, and you should use this pure yeast, and you should add this yeast, and so all magical stuff for the brewers. And then so Gregg was very much kind of this he sort of whet this appetite of this thinking back in Jamaica. And one of the things he wanted to do was to select, because he'd done this test, and in the star of his show, so he's doing in Copenhagen these the first time people are selecting a yeast strain and kind of the fermentation, and one of the star of his experiments was an Pombe of fission yeast. So of course he became very, very fascinated in the idea of not just merely selecting a yeast, but selecting a fission yeast.
Right.
But even in his own experiments, when he didn't use thunder, his fission yeast was flat. So there's immediately, even though Gregg is super enthusiastic about it, there's a caveat immediately in his work.
Okay.
But Allen and Ashby then continued on, and they were the ones, particularly Allen, who basically said, because at this time, this, as they say, this is a tremendous era of understanding of yeast. We're right behind sort of Pasteur, who's telling us that yeast is living. You go back a few years before yeast is seen as yeast is not alive; it's a chemical process. Right. And Pasteur comes and shows, no, it's a biological process, because yeast is alive. And then, oh my God, I forget the man. He won the Nobel Prize. He has an odd name, begins with a B, I forget. But then he showed, no, and you're both wrong. It's a biochemical process, because what he did is he took liquid out of a yeast cell and found it could still ferment. So he basically could ferment from a dead yeast cell. So he showed it really was a chemical reaction inside a living organism. Huh. So it's biochemistry. It's not chemistry, it's not biology, it's biochemistry. So this is all happening in this period. I mean, this is, as they say, he won the Nobel Prize, I think, 1905 or something for that. And so this is all exciting time. Yes, that's the name.
I looked up your article and just I did a Control F for a Nobel Prize.
Edward Buchner, yes. But Charles Allen comes along and he writes and says, look, I understand yeast is a big deal for the brewer. No, it's not. The Jamaica rum flavor comes from the bacteria. So he really shoots this whole thing down and has a radical way of thinking. And Ashby really continues this and really shows, he does some experiments with the fission yeast and says, this rum is shit, because he's doing really sterile thing. But what Ashby does show, and I can't remember if I hinted at it already, but certainly Ashby does a great work on this. And he basically shows that this fission yeast works in the acidic washes.
Right.
So when you get Saccharomyces goes on you because there's too much acidity, Pombe rolls along. And it rolls along very slowly. So this gives the bacteria even more opportunity. So what really happens is you get, and we can see this at Foursquare, it's just quite wonderful. You get a fermentation, and it starts off, and it's Saccharomyces doing the work, so it's racing along.
Right.
Saccharomyces is the sugar fungus, it's the machine. It's evolved to produce alcohol to kill its rivals. Okay, that's
okay.
why it rapidly produces Saccharomyces yeast That's what it does.
And it's a budding yeast, right?
Yeah, it's a budding yeast, so it multiplies quickly and it works rapidly, and that's what it's evolved to do, because it's evolved to kill the competing yeasts.
Yeah.
But what happens is that when the acidity rises, it quits. It can't handle it. But Pombe can. But Pombe works very slowly. So it does produce alcohol, but very slowly. So what happens is when you get this wonderful working in tandem, you end up with a respectable yield, but a wonderfully flavorful product, because you end up producing all of this acidity, and you get some reaction of production of these esters. So it plays a role, but it's not a direct role. So let me explain. There's two myths about Pombe. There's two myths. The first myth is the idea that it's lost, that it's not used in rum anymore, and Eureka, I'm going to bring it back.
Okay.
And of course, this is a very dangerous myth, because we've already seen certain individuals, not Stephen, but who like to present themselves as the great saviors of West Indian rum. We're going to bring Pombe back. Yeah, you'll probably know what I mean. So no, Pombe never left. It never left.
Don't call it a comeback. Got it.
Yeah, and then the second. Now, of course, you can argue it's less important or it's less prevalent, because it's still there in Jamaica, but the share of sort of Hiastra Jamaican rum of the global rum market, of course, is we're drinking loads. The world is drinking loads of light rum. Bacardi really didn't take off till around 1916 or so. So, so the relevance of Pombe around 1900 is very different to the relevance of Pombe circa 2020.
Okay.
But it's not gone. It's not left. You can see it's still there in Hamden. And of course, it's actually present. There was a wonderful PhD thesis published in 2015, and it was work on all the microflora in Australian distilleries. Sure enough, Pombe was there.
I think Stephen mentioned that one.
Yeah, so great confirmation that it's very much right. And you can see it under my microscope at Foursquare. I must put some pictures up. The trouble is electron microscope pictures of Pombe and my under the lab of actual real world cane juice. Not quite as good. But so Pombe is there. So and then the second myth, again, relates very much to whether you sort of read the word of Gray or you read the word of Allen, and this notion that there's some holy grail single strain of Pombe and you're going to add this into your fermentation and poof, you're going to make the greatest rum ever made. No, that is not going to happen.
Why did they believe, or why did one of them believe that?
Well, because of Greg and another. So here's Greg, and literally in Copenhagen, got 10 or 12 samples out, and he's putting these different strains of yeast in. And, I can't remember which number, but one of them is magical. But he does further experiments where he doesn't add dunder. And he finds shit.
Yeah, right.
He doesn't, the dunder is a big part of this equation. Yeah. So he even in his work, if you dig, you can see, no, it's not just the yeast. And that's really what Alan and Ashby are trying to tell you. Alan is basically trying to tell you, listen, the bacteria is king. And when you look at spirits, you can see this pendulum. So that, again, if you read my articles, this is one of the things that again, Alan described this very well. He basically said, look, you set up a fermentation. You can either set up the fermentation to favor yeast or favor bacteria. He said, you need yield, so you want to favor yeast. But if you favor yeast, you're going to lose some flavor. If you favor bacteria, you're going to use some, you're going to lose some yield. He said, you've got to strike a middle ground. This is what you do. And we see this when you look at every category. You can see that. So if you look at sort of the brewers or winemakers, they're absolutely favoring yeast. They don't want any bacteria in there. Yeast is king. The yeast, literally drives the flavor. But when you go to somewhere like take our natural fermentations or whatever, we're not adding any yeast at all. And what really, really matters is the bacteria. So the pendulum swung completely. But you can look at something like Scotch whiskey, and again, you can see the pendulum it's yeast, but it's not fully yeast, because you can, there's certain Scotch whiskeys, the 72-hour fermentation.
Right.
And, there's research now showing, lactobacillus is now active, despite the alcohol content, and that's affecting, the flavor of this whiskey. So, because, the wort in Scotch is not fully sterile. So you have something like Scotch whiskey where, bacteria is playing a role. It's not playing a bigger role as say, in Jamaica, in some rums. But again, you can also see an example. I remember in the Miami Rum Fest, we were talking, I was doing a panel with Roberto Sterales.
Mm-hmm.
They were talking about fermentation, and Roberto said, look, we sterilize this because the style of rum they want the yeast
plays a dominant role. Yeah.
So he has to, sterilize to get his yeast to be in total control of the flavor. Right. So again, you see this pendulum swinging depending on the spirit category.
Right.
And as they say, Alan was he was the first for this notion that, forget yeast. And of course, one of the things he was also trying to make the point was, and this was interesting, he basically said the yeast is more important in something like a fermented product, like beer. In other words, you picked up the subtle differences of the yeast. But when you distilled
because it's not distilled,
he was trying to say, no, then that doesn't become as important as obviously the flavors from the bacteria. So it's very interesting to read him. And of course, and then as Ashby really followed on from him. So, I think it's just those two myths that I think I prefer. They went to what, as Pombe is there, it's very important. Right. My God, we missed it if it wasn't. But it's not a panacea. It's not a
right.
It's not a oops. I'll add it in and oof.
It sounds like it's dependent on the context, right?
Yeah.
The other things happening, and I think my understanding what Stephen's fascination is coming from the idea of the role it can play in something like Arroyo's high pH process. Which I won't pretend that I understand all of this stuff, but that was my interpretation of it. But I think to me, this is, just talking about the different philosophies, different approaches with, someone like Sarah Yates. It's what makes rum so.
And that's a very important point that, everyone's not trying to make the same thing.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So one man's magical yeast may not mean much to someone else. It doesn't, I've always stressed this, and I'll give you the example of Foursquare. You can visit two distillers and get two different answers to the same question, and neither are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways I tease this is to say that if you come to the molasses section of Foursquare, just to the south, and you ask, let's say you ask someone in charge of molasses fermentation, or I'm wearing my molasses hat. You said to me, well, is yeast matter or terroir matter? I told you, no, it's not important at all. And then if you met me in the north section of Foursquare in the cane juice natural fermentation, and
got the juice hat on.
Suddenly I would say, absolutely, it's the most important thing in the whole world, and two different answers.
Yeah.
And you can do that with Scotch whiskey and bourbon whiskey.
Yeah.
Scots now are more sort of big on yeast in recent years, but with the time you could go to Scotland and ask them guys about yeast, and they'd be like, yeast? Who cares about yeast?
We'll call that the Richard Seale quantum state of superposition, where you can give both answers that are both correct.
And it really comes back to your philosophy and what you're wanting to make. But it also, as I say, I think sometimes we are seduced with easy answers to difficult challenges. And I think we want to believe that there's a magical yeast that has been lost. And if we just find it again, we'll make great. No, that's a great movie, but.
I'm writing the script right now.
John's working on that.
A little more complex, but so my challenge, of course, would be is how do I say in one sense, no, it's not that big a deal, but emphasize, yes, it is also a very big deal because it basically allows things to happen in the fermentation you could not do with Saccharomyces alone.
Right.
Because if you have Saccharomyces alone, it's going to race along, it's going to produce loads of alcohol, and then the alcohol is going to semi-sterilize the wash, and you're just not going to get the same flavor development as you get when you have Saccharomyces and S. Pombe working in tandem.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't just say, because of that, oh my goodness, I'm just going to cultivate a strain of S. Pombe and put it in. It's going to
done.
No.
Yeah.
You have to realize that it's the symbiotic relationship between the two yeasts and the bacteria that when you get that right, you get this really excellent result. And one of the things that Jamaicans observe is, again, his beautiful, big, fatty head on top. And so one of the things you will notice when you come to Foursquare with our cane juice, because we do the cane juice fermentations are natural and they're slow, they take several weeks. They're open and you can stick your head over them. You can't, if you did that in molasses fermentation, you'd be dead because they're rapid, so the CO2 is coming off rapid. You cannot stick your head in molasses.
You can do it, but only once.
Yes, you will collapse. But the beauty of the cane juice ones is if you walk into my cane juice room and the smell is unbelievable. I mean, it's like walking into a food orchard. It's just spectacular. And even the BRE tour, which was November, which was several weeks after we finished, we distilled down to about August, fermented down to about August, and those guys were there in the first week of November. They could still smell the room.
Wow.
Still smell, and yeah, I mean, without that symbiotic way in which those yeasts work, you would not get as rich and as fruity a flavor anyway. So my role to you is to say yes, S. Pombe is very important, but maybe not in the simple way that some marketeers will now try to exploit.
Sure,
because that's not fair.
Right.
It is the first label of rum to say we made this with S. Pombe. It's the greatest thing.
I was expecting to see exactly that on the back label when it comes out.
That's coming, and the story will be, we resurrected this yeast lost and found in a vault, some bullshit like that.
So you mentioned the Barbados Rum Experience. That's where the samples that we received came from. I know that took place for the first time in November. How did that all come together? And looking back at it now, what were kind of some of the highlights of being able to do something like that for the first time?
So the inspiration for that actually came April 2018. I think it's 2018. Yeah. We had this wonderful visit where all of these rum enthusiasts literally got together on the internet. Just, people who physically haven't met, but met through rum groups. And I think it started first with the American side, and then they started grouping some of the European connections. And long story short, they basically agreed, let's all visit Foursquare in April. Mm-hmm. And most of them stayed in one hotel. And so what we did is we then organized, obviously, a lovely tour. But then we said, okay, now we'll put on some events. And I think we put on a dinner, and I think we put on a lunch. And then we helped them coordinate their visits to Mount Gay and Nicholas. So everything was paid for by them. I mean, we obviously put on a tour, and we
you gave them a hand.
We put on some, as they say, we did a couple of events, which we would have paid for some dinners and stuff, but they paid their hotel and everything. So they basically coordinated their holidays all together.
That's the power of rum.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. So part of the mission was to kind of recreate that instead of everyone visiting us
at separate times.
Everybody visit together. And the other part of that was, well, let's make this proper experience. Mm-hmm. Let's go another level. Mm-hmm. And so, you might say the other inspiration would have been, say, everyone set New Orleans for Tales of the Cocktail, and you have a whole week of seminars. So let's have a whole week of seminars. And the seminars are not, there's going to be brand events, but the seminars are going to be educational. So we're going to educate you, not just on rum, but we're going to educate you on Barbados.
Right.
And it went absolutely brilliant. People loved it and got the feedback that we wanted. People said, look, I can't, we had some of the most wonderful endorsements, which we'll post on the page through the year as we promote the second one. But we had the theme of these endorsements were like, I came expecting a rum tour, and I ended up learning so much about Barbados.
You had some big time scholars and things like that doing presentations.
Right, exactly. The idea with these seminars was, they weren't, as I said, there were events, Mount Gay put on a spectacular dinner at one of the things. But the idea with the seminars is they wouldn't be branded per se. I mean, mine, I did two. And one was a brand one, if you like, because it was what we're doing at Foursquare, but it was what we were doing at Foursquare in the historical context. So, I talked about our new double retort still, but I explained why in Barbados we use double retort pot stills, and I went through the history of it and that kind of thing. So the idea really was, yes, I talked about Foursquare, but you learn. The other seminar I did was on origins, and that didn't mention a single brand at all. Origins is a subject that I only get to sort of briefly mention in other seminars. If I do a history of Barbados Rum, I can only spend, the 5 minutes on, the origin. Here, I could spend a whole seminar on origins and could look at all the competing claims, et cetera, et cetera. And so it was great. I really enjoyed doing that one. So yeah, the idea was, again, we'd have a central hotel. Everyone stayed there. You don't have to. So what you do with the event can be broken down. The package doesn't include the hotel. You book the hotel. Obviously, we get a discount rate.
Right.
And then you can buy a package with everything, or you can buy just tours only, or seminars only. But most people went for the full package. And so basically, what the package was is you got to attend all the seminars and you got the transport to the tours. And the tours were special, tailored tours. They were not the average, tour that you get. So it was a spectacular success. It really was.
Yeah, well, I know John and I both heard great things from people who were
attended. Yeah,
who were able to make it there.
And made us insanely jealous.
yeah. So penciling in our future plans now.
COVID was a real trial.
Yeah.
So we're hoping next year we won't have that, because that was and we the COVID unit were vigilant on us. And of course, not that we wanted to try and get with anything, but the point is, sometimes you might make a mistake or whatever.
Right.
And of course, all the crew were very supportive of that. They knew, we had to, mask wearing and so, all the seminars. And like when I was doing the seminar, in my first one, I kept walking too close to the audience, so they had to come and tell me, no, you need to stay. Do not cross. We put a little line,
put a little tape. Yeah.
Yeah. So, do not cross this line.
Yeah.
You can to the audience. But yeah, so COVID just, added another dimension to challenges.
I think in a way, though, it also makes those events feel a little more special. Because it's kind of like the first time people have been able to do stuff like that, traveling together and things. So I know a couple of the rum festivals that I made it to in the U.S. In this sort of kind of post-COVID reality, that was the feeling of, there's protocols in place, we're wearing masks, but man, this feels great to be together again.
No, and we know probably some people simply didn't come because people don't want to travel in this COVID. So, we're really hoping for and it should work out, because one of the things that this year is because of the rooms, they had to space people out. The rooms had less capacity. So that meant we had less spaces we could sell. Right. So what I'm hoping is next year we can have more space, and of course we will be able to sell more.
Bigger and better.
Yeah, exactly.
You hear that, Will? Richard just said we got to come next year.
Right? Yeah. There's space for it. Yeah.
I tell you this in absolute honesty. If if you really want to visit, if you really want to go on a rum distillery visit, you will not get the same experience on your own, because you're going to visit all three. You're going to be there with other rum enthusiasts. And again, we do an education not just on rum, but on Barbados.
Right.
But it's linked with the rum. In other words, the idea is that you're going to come away really appreciating Barbados and understanding how the special parts of Barbados are linked to the rum.
Yeah.
Because one of the things, I love to explain in my origins seminar is, we don't understand how back in the 1600s, how certain things mattered or made the difference between having an industry and not having an industry.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, Barbados having really excellent supply of water compared to the other islands, that literally makes a difference between existing and not existing. And, things that we would take for granted now. And so one of the things I love to explain in the origin seminars is the sort of serendipitous things that allow the rum industry to be born. Because, we tend to think in modern sense today, you can just go and make an industry anywhere. But in the 1600s, you had to have certain things fall into place for you, for these things to happen.
Well, speaking of history and cultural significance, we're recording this on December 15th, and just a couple of weeks ago, Barbados became a republic.
Yes.
And you all elected the island's first ever president, I know, recently as well. So I know that's just in the rearview mirror, but I also understand it's like decades in the making. So, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are for yourself and for the people of Barbados at this time. And then does that change anything for you at Foursquare at all?
No. So basically, we've always been arguably a republic. What I mean is, in other words, the Queen has never had any. We've never had any power from the monarchy since we're independent. But when we became independent in 1966, there were a couple of institutions that were retained. One was our sort of highest court of appeal was still the House of Lords back in the UK.
Okay.
And one was, of course, having the Queen as the head of state. I'm not an expert on the thinking of why those were retained, but you have to imagine, the independence. Even then, the independence was quite relatively symbolic because we'd been self-governed from about the 50s. So 1966, we make this, officially independent, but we were already self-governed. So it wasn't like in 1966, someone handed over government to us. We were ready to. So about 66, we make the break. We are now an independent country. We're not a colony anymore. But for various reasons, as they say, and I think quite clever, because, if you can make that big change, but smooth it with a few small
institutions. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so we eventually changed the judiciary. Now there's a Caribbean Court of Appeal.
Mm-hmm.
And really, yes, it really was something that should be done, should have been done a long time. And it's not that we want to break from the Commonwealth, which is all the ex-colonies grouping, and that's fine. But it's kind of it became an absurdity to have the Queen as the head of state. It was always a transitory period. But one of the amusing things about this, and you guys wouldn't know that. I don't know if you know the TV show, but the famous TV show Yes Minister.
I don't know that one. I was thinking you might say The Crown. That's the Commonwealth show I'm familiar with.
There's a wonderful episode where they explain that you could frame a referendum depending on whatever way you want the result to be.
Right.
And the Green one is a great example of that. So if you ran around and you said, your referenda question was, shall we get rid of the Queen? No would probably win.
Mm-hmm.
That's because Barbadians have this great respect for the Queen personally. And you should go around and say things like, shall we remove the Queen? And if you use like a negative language, I feel sure that no would probably win. If it didn't win, I bet it would do pretty well. Because we just have this sort of, Barbadians, we just have this kind of inherent, we don't want to hurt anybody. But if you went around and you had the referendum and you said something like, should the Barbadian be head of state? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So
it's all in how you frame it.
Exactly. So one of the reasons why you kind of hear this sort of chatter on both sides is the problem is nobody really has a problem with having a Barbadian head of state. But then there's sort of a faction that sort of gets very upset at the thought of booting the Queen.
Shoving the Queen aside. Yeah.
That's, well, should we really do that? So you do have that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, one last thing. I know we've kept you for a while, and we're beyond the Hiastra now. But one thing, I saw this reported a little bit earlier in the year, and I hadn't heard much about it since, but I thought it was really interesting, was back in May, there was an announcement that you were funding new scholarships at the University of the West Indies, and kind of the Department of History and Philosophy specifically dedicated to researching rum history in Barbados. Yes. And you were doing, I think, 3 doctoral scholarships and some postdoctoral fellowships.
So this was actually before COVID. Day.
Okay.
And then COVID really screwed it because, people couldn't go, the research places are closed.
Yeah.
It's very, very difficult and no one was going in it. So we kind of delayed it. No, the idea really is we created a fund, still part of the money. Mm-hmm. And there's 2 aspects to how the funds would be used. Barbados is currently has applying for UNESCO status,
World Heritage.
World Heritage site for sugar and rum.
Okay.
So it's to help with that, with the research for that application. So we already have World Heritage status for the city of Bridgetown. What we want to have, and it would be a multiple site World Heritage status for sugar and rum. So, we'd like more, I'd like to protect more sites. I mean, we'd like to protect sort of more of the historic sites, but
yes, like adding in sites to protect takes more and more work and research and everything.
You need the cooperation of the owners and all the rest of it. But anyway, so the idea really is there's an ongoing need for research to help that, make that project a reality. And so we're happy to fund that. But then the other one is to basically fund PhD and postdoc research on rum. So we have a couple of applications before us. So we, again, COVID, every time we seem to get going, there seems to be a COVID outbreak.
A new variant, yeah.
And we're just coming to the end of our Delta wave, thank goodness. I suppose there might be an Omicron wave behind it.
That's starting up here in the U.S.
Yeah, we had a bad wave with Delta, but anyway. So the idea, yes, and it's again part of a bigger picture. So you want to get some, PhD or postdoc work done. You get some work published. Eventually, the history course may have some rum history in the history course, because of the research. And then, eventually the high school history course might have a little more rum in it.
I love the idea of high school classes taking field trips to Foursquare.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
So yes, so there's a big picture on it. And I'll be honest with you too, it's a little bit of a counter to, it's one of these things, the rum category is getting stronger. It's getting more valuable. And anything that's more valuable is going to be exploited.
Yeah.
Right.
And, there's one famous brand, you could probably guess who it is, but it's sort of comedic. Some of the advertising, sort of the advertising was something like this, rum was terrible and it was called Kill Devil because it tasted really nasty. And then we came along and revolutionized it and made really good rum.
Yeah.
Complete historical nonsense. But it does hint at the problem if you don't do the proper research and you don't put the proper things down. And you simply cannot leave research in the hands of commercial entities. So as much as I would have, loved to keep doing, research or hire some people or whatever, that's not going to do. It has to be independent. It has to be properly scrutinized. And so therefore, that's why I approached the University of Western. It cannot be the Foursquare guide.
Right.
Right.
There has to be a firewall there. Yeah.
Yeah, it has to be done by scholars and done properly.
So when someone applies for one of those scholarships, you're kept aside? It's not like you're calling them up.
I do get that part. So there's a committee.
Okay.
And there's a couple of people from the university side, and then there's a couple of people from my side.
Okay.
And yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I do get to choose the areas. But we're very open. I mean, I obviously have my favorite areas, but
you're not like looking over their shoulder as they're doing the research and like giving notes and stuff like that.
No, and we don't, for example, we don't take any ownership in what they produce.
Okay.
So under the agreement, they own it. All we get is a license to use it. So that's what keeps it absolutely pure. Like we can't vary it or something like that. We can't.
Right.
In other words, it's there. They own the research. They can publish the books. Well, actually, the way it works is the university ends up owning it unless the researcher agrees with the university. So more or less anything that we output is going to be owned by the university.
Yeah.
And we just get this license. So, we discover, let's say we discover something interesting about Foursquare, and I have a license. I can reprint it and whatever. Mm-hmm. So that's fine. But our mission was not. This is not a financial, exercise. So, we would love to see work get published. We'd love to see it commercially successful. We'd love to see another book on rum come out. But as I say, the university own it. We won't own, even though we back the research, we don't retain any ownership in it at all.
Right, but sort of a potential, rising tide that lifts the whole category and.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole point. In other words, as they say, you need to protect it from an exploitation point of view. The point is, Barbados has this very special provenance in rum. And the more that it's understood, it's only going to assist the value of the provenance. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's one thing for me to just say, oh yeah, we've been making rum since 1600s, but we want you to be able to dig and dive into that and understand. And yeah, it gives credence to the whole Barbados rum category.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I know we've kept you for a while. It was great getting to learn more about Hiastra and that it's more than just Hiastra. There's a lot going on here, and it's exciting just to know that everything you're doing down there with cane juice seems like it's going to be a part of Foursquare and how we think about it going forward. So I'm excited to see all the ways that expresses itself in what comes out of it. Like you said, I think maybe 5 years from now, some of those cane juice barrels are going to be ready. So we're gonna set a reminder for that. And, be keeping our eyes out then. But before we go, anything else to add or anything we didn't get to that you want people to know about?
No, because you really, you touched on the BRE and certainly anyone who's thinking about visiting Barbados, check the FB page.
We'll put a link up to the website in the show notes.
I think we've fixed the dates for next year, but we might not have published them. I think one of these is we're going to check and double check with a few of the guest lecturers to make sure they come.
Yeah.
So, but we've got plenty of time. I think what will happen is once the new year turns, we'll sort of start promoting it in earnest.
Yeah.
But it is. Yeah. I mean, and that's what we want. We want that to be the event that you come to Barbados, and it doesn't even matter if you've been to Barbados or you've been to distilleries. You're going to have a complete new level of experience.
I'm going to start saving up right now.
One event we sponsored was Cigar Night. So
I saw that. I was going back and looking through the agenda, and I think it said, Richard Seale Cigar Night.
Of course, I would sponsor Cigar Night.
I'm going to sponsor Board Game Night, if you'll allow me.
Board Game Night. Not quite as cool as Cigar Night.
No, it's not. But you know what? It is what it is. All right, so that was our interview with Richard Seale, part 2, you might say. And we're really, really grateful to him for the time he spent with us and talking about that. And so much to learn in terms of what Foursquare is doing and what the future holds. It's really exciting, and really thankful to hear from him. And a nice surprise at the end of the year to kind of close out this year with a great interview. So if you liked what you heard and you want to hear more, Will, where are we at on social? Where can we hear from people? What are we doing?
I believe we're on Facebook at the Rumcast, on Instagram at the Rumcast. People can always reach us directly. It's like a direct line to us when you send those emails to host@rumcast.com. We're always checking those. It's always great to get little notes. If you have a Christmas wish list for the rum world, please share it with us. Send us an email, host@rumcast.com. We'd love to see some of those. Or if you'd like to give us the ultimate Christmas gift, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give us a little review. Tell us what you think of the show. Those are always great. They help more people discover the podcast. Like if Apple sees we have a lot of reviews, they'll kind of surface the podcast for more people, and that's always helpful. But with all that said, John, I hope that you have a wonderful finish to the end of the year. If you're celebrating Christmas, I hope that goes great. I know I'm about to hit the road to visit some family, and I'm really looking forward to that. And yeah, we'll actually be back next week with our year in review episode. So this is not goodbye yet for 2021. We'll save our New Year's wishes for that episode. So